Welcome to Sonar Summit. Today I'm joined by someone who helped shape the whole DevOps movement, I guess, and who is now actively exploring what AI native software development looks like actually in practice and not just from the sofa. Patrick, we have a very long time working together, so welcome and happy to have you on board.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Edgar. And it's debatable because I do work on the sofa most of the time, but it is actually indeed it's been a long time since 2009 with DevOps, and now AI is just a new thing, and that seems to be kind of probably over my career the thing. Like I learned to live with the first internet, then the cloud, the mobile, serverless, you name it, kind of like the waves, and yeah, this is now the fun wave to be, and the learning is great. So.
Fantastic. Maybe before we start, can you do a short introduction? What are you doing today? I know we worked a lot on developer education, and we do a lot of things related to AI and agents and a lot. And I think something that you are working on your daily life is quite related to harnessing the AI and make it useful. So why don't we start with you giving us a bit more on what's your everyday job today? What do you do?
Well, I would say I have kind of a dual job. One is to be in the community and not about like broadcasting whatever I think about, but it's basically learning from the community and the industry and kind of like doing that. I'm also kind of doing this within the context of AI native dev community, where people can kind of come together and share their learnings. And I also organize a conference on that. And then while I look in the industry and kind of get like understanding and help people make sense of the world, I kind of feed that also back into the company I work for at Tessel, where we are building something that helps agents be more efficient. And think of me as like a little bit the person that brings the industry back to within the organization. So we're not always heads down into, oh, this is a cool thing. Yeah, okay. Industry thinks about it differently, and that's kind of a little bit my role. So, it's great that like what you think and see and advise, you also see happening within a company. So I like to have both things and do it there. And context like. Tesla is a startup, a year and a half ago, 2 years. We're at the third pivot as it is in the industry. But we had like spec-driven was one of them. We were really deep on that. And right now it is very much focused on context and context engineering. We're not selling you another agent. We're not selling you something else. But like what we try to do is to make the existing tools and the agentic tools shine better, like with like optimized context.
That's cool. Something you mentioned is very related to product that I love is actually when you build something and then you see it flourishing in organization of your customers or users. This is always very satisfying. In your recent blog posts, you wrote something super interesting, and I think the whole our topic today will be around this, is actually a context flywheel, not limited to this. But what struck me, you said that a real differentiation isn't actually, the model or programming language in which your agent is written, but actually the organizational context. So it's not even about one file, I believe. Mm-hmm. But I believe this idea doesn't come from nowhere. I think you mentioned that you work with a lot of teams and community and you're experimenting. So maybe you can give us more insights of what you're seeing actually right now in teams who actually actively use AI coding agents. Mm-hmm. And like, what are they struggling with? What are their, like, let's say, top challenges that they have to overcome?
Sure. Yeah, the perspective that I deliberately took was of the organizational level. So if you would think of code actually is getting more and more getting the agent the right context. And then the context is both technical, organizational, team level, and so on. So that brings it up that, once you kind of start like building this together, you get like the agents performing better. And, funny enough, also the humans perform better because they have better documentation. So this is something that is happening in practice. A lot of people, maybe their first step was, hey, the agent's not like behaving as I want. Let me write something to AgentMD, ClaudeMD. That's great. Then that becomes maybe some more complex, or they need to pull in context from another kind of repo, a microservice, which they don't have. They have some context. Oh, let's pull it in. Oh, maybe it's an open source library. Let's pull that context in. Oh, I have my tickets. So you see kind of all kind of those pieces get in more and more, and it's like expanding as such. I would say it is a flywheel in a way. Like once one team starts with it, like the other kind of gets better at it, and then they get better context, so their job gets better, and eventually that goes into the whole organization. We can probably come back to it later. There is obviously this on the technology level. Like I understand the technical systems better, and then you can even go broader and say, I understand my business context level better. So, again, on that product level and the technical level, you kind of start building that context on both sides, which is unique to kind of companies building this, step by step.
Yeah, that's cool. Something that really sparked my interest, because I feel the same when I restart my agent session every time in the terminal, where I have like 3 or 4, is that you wrote something around every agent session is like a new hire. Although the span of this hire is quite short because context gets exploded, and you feel actually how it degrades with, like, say, every cycle. But then in some other publication that you did, you wrote also about very interesting concept called context development life cycles, where you have this generate, evaluate, distribute, and observe. It's not only about, pressing more documentation upfront and like a life cycle will flourish. Why did you feel that there's a need to frame this specific 4 steps together? Or why do you see that as a, obviously SDLC was probably one of the, let's say, inspirations to that, because letters are the same plus minus, but it's different concept.
Yeah.
But can you maybe tell more about why exactly these steps that you believe frame that the best?
Yeah. So first thing on the onboarding, which is funnily enough, we've always struggled with writing documentation for people, that come in and it got stale and so on. Now people have an incentive. Yes, I got as well. People are writing now context for the agent. They have like this, self-interest of writing it for the agent, so they don't have to do it over and over again. So that helps. And once that's written, that kind of helps people, but also the agents. And where does it help people? It helps new people almost like with a up-to-date README, and it helps the agent with kind of more up-to-date context. Now, as you know, like one of the reasons that documentation got stale is that the organization changes all the time. So documentation on its own has a life cycle. And for many people now changing their Claude MD or similar, they go in once, they update it, and then they kind of forget about this. And then they say, oh, it doesn't work anymore. What do we do? Oh, we do like a manual check and say, hey, we changed a few lines, we changed a few words, we added something. I think it's okay. This is actually where the word vibe check came from. Like whenever there was a new model, we were doing a vibe check on like, hey, is our context still operating the way we want it to operate? It had nothing to do initially with kind of like the vibe coding and accepting YOLO mode apps. It was about like the check, and the more engineering like phrase for this is when you have context or prompts, you build a test for this, and the test equivalent within that world would be called an eval, right? So yes, I'm writing those tests, I'm writing those evals, solo in my repo, all good. Now, it's almost like building an app. I build an app, I write my tests, it all looks green. But we all know that it works on my machine. It works in my context. So the next step is typically I want to distribute that, deploy that, like in CI/CD terms, to other people. And then I want to make sure they use it or they don't use it. Sometimes I want to force the use of maybe some security rules, some kind of governance guidelines, or like the team guidelines. And then after that, like what you really want is I put it now in deployment, and in our DevOps pipeline, what we do is we actually see when things fail. Like there's the intended fails, but we try to cover that with our evals. But then people using our context, they have different results. Why is that? And so you start a little bit of that kind of like spelunking of logs, spelunking of like what, why? Oh, they have a different model. No, they're using a different coding agent. No, like, you know, like something happened. The API has changed that they're like referring to, or we changed the way we do our own things. All these things happen. And what you happen right now is that you see more and more people looking not just at, oh, it worked for me, but they're looking at logs. They're looking at like what the agent did. They're tracking that. And it becomes so an observability tool. So we put it first, we test it with evals, we distribute it, deploy it, we see it out in the wild, and then we pick up signals. One of the signals is if, let's say, 15 people that are developing and the agent always doesn't know the answer, or it always gives an error, maybe we should all update that as a central thing. And that comes back to, hey, if I'm a platform team or a developer experience team, maybe I can find the signals across the teams and then like help them curate the context across. So that's where the observability comes in. And then once you have that, like, you know, we know what to improve, you start in the generate or create, like assisted with a coding agent to update your Claude MD, you run your evals, you kind of distribute, you observe. And I think what the power is of that loop that, like, you know, draw me through it is I got so frustrated that it was like this artisanal manual thing of optimizing my context. And I just wanted like engineering rigor, like just run these tests and then I know, and then I know what to fix. And like the time we save by giving it context, there were times we totally got lost when it didn't give the right context. So anyway, that was kind of a lot of that early things. I had like prototypes of Docker files being created, but how do I actually like test them? So I think slowly we're adapting this in the industry as a way to have an engineering loop. Now, first of all, we are discovering this in agentic coding. It exists already in agentic in general. We're just like, you know, 2 years later from what they're doing, but it is now becoming available in our tools. And that's kind of also where Tesla tries to kind of not like just say, hey, we're distributing a marketplace, but we actually give you, you know, advice on optimizing your context and keeping it up to date.
Yeah, something that you mentioned is very interesting, the evals.
Mm-hmm.
And I know a lot of people in particular who are now building agents or agentic workflows. There's always a question, where do you land on an eval, and is, you know, this benchmark better than this benchmark, etc.
Mm-hmm.
But what is your take on what is good enough when you run an eval and you say like, okay, now it's ready, now the beast is gone and it will produce value, right?
Yeah.
And remember the early days, the acceptance of tabs was, I remember, ridiculously low, around 20%, and it was increased to 34%. And somehow this whole vibe about measuring the eval like dissolved. People just say we're better. Of course, models to compare to each other, it's easy because it's mathematical or physical or chemistry or etc. because it's deterministic, right? You have a very clear answer, very clear question. Mm-hmm. But now if we talk about coding, we all know that the same functionality can be written in probably hundreds of possible ways, and they're all correct. Depends on what you measure. If you measure performance or energy efficiency or memory efficiency or CPU utilization, we can find even more, let's say, parameters. What is from your experience when you have a product, you have an agent, you want to launch it? How do you treat the eval? Where you drive that line where you say it's enough? Mm-hmm. Let's give it to users. Let's see how it runs.
Yeah, maybe first give the context of you know, how would an eval work? I have my repo and it's set up with my coding files, my agent MD and all that stuff. I give it a prompt and then it does something, maybe agentically coding, and it gives a result, right? So I'm assessing that loop by giving, this is the input, this is the prompt, and I'm judging the output. Right. Now, there's a lot of eval systems that say, well, I have some mathematical, statistical thing or measuring. They're kind of missing the business point. Like your value is going to be specific. I want this to be done with that prompt. often think of this almost like a behavioral driven. I have a scenario that I'm describing how to do a certain thing. Okay, so that kind of gives you, like, how do we describe the scenarios? We could do that like in our typical tests. Like, hey, we run it, it looks good. Maybe a security scan, maybe a test coverage, it all works well. Or we could use quite commonly an LLM as a judge. So we say, given this input, given this prompt, what do you think, right? And it gives like its judgment. The problem is, it is not deterministic as our tests used to be. It's not like a 0-1, how it actually is true or not true, because maybe today it gives that result, tomorrow it gives another. I changed the prompt, 5 of my previous things failed, and now the new thing succeeds. So it feels a little bit like a whack-a-mole. Like, what do I do? And then you kind of settle into, this is okay, this is not okay. Now, the trick about evals is not looking at it like tests, but more like error budgets. I assume X amount of these things should succeed. Now, you put different error buckets on different risk levels. Like, these criteria always have to pass. The other ones, a little bit more nice to have. These ones, vanity metrics, something like that. So the trick is that to treat it more like a monitoring than like a gating. Now, where you put that line is going to be dependent on the risk you're taking with a certain functionality and how much effort you want to go in. Now, I'm not going to lie. It's like saying, well, I'm writing code without tests and it goes way faster because I don't have to write tests. And okay, hey, I'm writing context. I'm doing this with evals. Doing it with evals will kind of have more work in a way. Yes, we can have the LLM suggest scenarios and so on, but we'll still have to say yes, no to this makes sense or no. And when it fails, we also have to say this is acceptable, yes, no. Now, in a business level, this is hard, like traditional way of working, because it's not the technical person who can say yes, no, because they don't know how critical or riskful the PM wants to take the product. Now, in coding, you might say that if part of this is generating technical documentation, then the developer can say, yes, that's okay, that's acceptable, yes, no. If it's functional, the business has to say. So finding that balance, I'd love to say the number is 54, but it's not. Like, it's just going to depend on your case, much like error budgets are how much risk, how much you're willing to take. But the advice is also to split it up as the must-haves and the not-haves, and to kind of try to limit results to a binary. Saying it's kind of okay is not really helpful. It is okay or not okay. Try to be very specific in your evals on your criteria and try to make them a binary, because the rest is really hard to manage in that case.
There's something very interesting that you touched is test, let's say, comparison to test-driven development, right? So I think you said something around the lines, if we test code, why don't we actually test context?
Mm-hmm.
So what does that look like in reality? Do I just have static context everywhere and I only change the prompt? Or I know statistically, if you want to do A/B testing, etc., you usually need to minimize to changing one thing at a time.
Mm-hmm.
So when you say testing context, does it mean that you keep everything the same and you only iterate on adding new tools to context, etc.? Or how do you see that?
Yeah.
Maybe you have one scenario or some kind of evaluation that you did and
sure,
some good example.
So the let's say I have a microservice repository, and it's part of this is that it sticks to, it needs to have authentication, for example, on these endpoints, or it needs to be RESTful, or some other guidelines I put in there to do it. When I kind of would iterate on that, I would say I'm probably writing and writing prompts, and all of a sudden I find something the model doesn't know anymore, right? Or it does it wrong. Let me add that to my rules, right? So kind of, and then I do it again and it says, it seems to be better as such. Now, if you do that manual over time, it's going to be very tedious. So I want to almost have a test suite that says, given that input, I'm going to run this again. And that kind of gives that like more change impact analysis. Now, when do I want to run this? I would say, think of it as you have your coding agent and it has a bunch of inputs when it needs to get a certain output. So if your code would change and you have a different setup or a different README or anything there, it might be that your context doesn't apply anymore. They're out of sync. If I change my dependencies of my code, maybe it does something different because the constructs are now different and it doesn't matter. So anytime you change a kind of a dependency in that pipeline of, hey, this is the input and this is the output, then I want to rerun again. Now, not every test is that easy to run, and some are more costly than others, similar to a unit test and an end-to-end test. So you have to think about like, what are things that can give me quick feedback? And then, no pun intended, but there's the Sonar model that says, do the quick tests. If they fail, you get quick feedback. Then kind of go to the next phase of another set of tests and then go further. And that kind of saves you the time instead of running all the tests all the time. And then when you have a major deploy, you actually go there. Now, I would advise to still think in 2 layers, similar to unit test and BDD. I can iterate on my context just with a couple of unit tests very fast that I improve. And then when I do actually the full deploy, I'm going to run my whole suite of the BDD. So that is very true, again, with context, how you treat, like how much you run. Because running everything all the time will kind of become more costly of doing it. But a quick sanity check is something. So you could do that either in, while you're coding, almost like get like TDD loop fast feedback. You can do it in your Git commit. You can do it in CI/CD. You can do it later. It's just a matter of like how costly and how long and you want to run on this. Does that make sense?
Yes. So maybe now we can actually connect the 2 dots. So on one side, you say, if you build an agent, yes, you have a lot of moving parts. But if you just change your model, I think you said before, even changing model can inevitably destroy your eval that you did before because the model was trained differently, different values, different weights, and so on. And context is still kind of the king. So it's not actually, let's say, a life cycle that has, let's say, an start and end, which is more like a life cycle. And this is also what your second blog post is about. And this shift of life cycle is actually a process, and a flywheel is out of compound advantage that you get from testing repeatedly, let's say, on the same number of parameters, right? So what does it change when you say, okay, we run the flywheel, let's say, across multiple iterations? So what is the compound value that you're getting from that? Can you maybe touch on this?
So maybe I'll first touch on if you're just doing the life cycle, one of the things that you have to care about is also like you need to run it multiple times. So we didn't touch on that yet, but that kind of hardens it. So you get like a roughly thing. Think about like flaky tests that you have to run again for a while. Now, you get certainty, and when you're then offering your context to somebody else, let's say your microservice is then being used for somebody else, they can also use that context to test and get better at that. So that's technically compounding. So one user can do it, your team can do it, people outside of your team can reuse your context, and that goes further. Now, initially when I wrote the post, I said like, okay, this is kind of your moat. Where are you going for? Now, the moat isn't actually per se in the technical things, because somebody else can kind of like, have the same cycle, write the same code and doing it. The compounding thing will be in the business level. Like we learned what worked and what didn't work. We learned what like our specific kind of domain knowledge is that goes in there. So the more and the faster we can put things out there, the better we refine our context, the better results we get with our agents, the better our experiments going to be. So that's kind of the compounding competitive edge, which like somebody might copy a snapshot of your context or like your current state of your product, but they don't have that build up and the whole kind of build up of knowledge. And that's in my probably experience. The next level is we're getting code to context, and then context maybe in some memory, but ultimately it's going to be knowledge about your domain and your company, and that's your accumulation over time across the teams.
So this is actually interesting, because I think you mentioned 4 ROIs is one side where, okay, we get our let's say better agent quality. We have deeper senior expertise where, you have some tools for sharing stuff across your teams and not just what works on my machine. Then you have team learning, right? That whatever I do, let's say on my machine, that helps me produce better software is also helpful for others. And how do you share this know-how? And then also organizational data and alignment, right?
Yeah.
And it feels like if you nail all 4, you almost create some kind of competitive advantage actually for accelerating the speed with which you are developing software. Mm-hmm. And I think would be interesting if all of us and all the companies will follow this great 4 principles. What is actually the defensiveness of that, right? Because as we see, models are commoditizing, so we're all getting to the right top corner, and the next moves are essentially just the bits, or then you have specialized ones, right? The tool is converging because nobody wants to yet create a new, API, MCP tool, etc. But arguably, the structure or tested version of context becomes essentially the moat, right? Mm-hmm. So why can't someone, for example, imagine a developer who built their moat in one company, will go to another one and take the context with them. So is there some, it's very, very easily said, right? It's not that it takes a sack on the shoulder and he moves to another component, he unpacks it and everything works.
Correct.
You still have dependency on languages, frameworks, but how do you see this where, AI is not really isolated to one specific company or IP in a way?
The, very beginning in DevOps, there was this post about web operations from Flickr at the time. And it was, if we reduced the number of milliseconds on, the web, we got more revenue. Right? So at that time, your technology was definitely your moat by saying, hey, we're doing like things way better than anybody else. We have that a little bit right now. Like, hey, I'm doing AI, I can get features out, like it's way better and so on. Now, eventually everybody could read somewhere all the techniques that like they used and they're still using to do that. Like, it's not like that, it's impossible. Now, for some reason, people do stay in different levels of expertise and different level kind of like execution modes, and also on that. Now, imagine the agents do everything, and they're like, okay, I can just hire my agent Edgar, and they would kind of build everything perfectly to do that. It's still the person that has to steer that agent in the right direction, giving the instructions that need to be built. And then you will probably get closer to, what is my competitive edge? Can I build a feature everybody wants? Can I build something that, like, do I have a network that actually listens to when I have a new feature? So it's the whole market industry that like still stays the same, but we're able to faster execute. Now, there is a funny thing about, like, imagine we could put out all our backlog, right? And everything gets built. What we learned a little bit with, I don't know, maybe it's like not correct, but if you would update your software every day, your users go crazy.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So maybe their agents might go crazy, but the users have like a capacity of dealing with like change and trust and other pieces as well. So it's not like we've solved all the things that I can copy from like solving the other pieces of the process to be competitive in that world. So
this is actually an interesting one. So I just want to build on the last point that you said when, if we go wild and now we give all the LLMs or agents autonomously to actually go and act in our domains and build new features, UIs, experiences, and so on. Is it the context that remains this, let's say, last mile guardrail that will actually make agents truly autonomously, where you can just give let's say, a spec and it will just go and build with the same, let's say, reliable architecture, policies, quality level, security checks, and all that in place? Mm-hmm. I don't know, does the context effectively becomes this living architecture so that whenever you build something, it just feeds back and then you have this never-ending growing loop? Or how do you see this? What does it miss? Is the context really the guardrail? And if it actually is the, let's say, the golden key for autonomous agentic development, let's put it that way.
So I would more position context as the right fuel than it is kind of the guardrail. Like if you have a new fuel and you have rocket fuel, you can go faster than all the others, but you still have to steer it in the right direction. So that is kind of not solved, but it is a little bit like companies that didn't have, for example, a good release pipeline and they're jumping into the AI world. They missed a step and they're struggling with all the changes and the rigor and the testing and the observing kind of going there as well. So now the context will enable us to unlock the other things, but it's not the end thing. But we need to know that it needs grooming, it needs updating, it needs testing to kind of keep that in a good shape. It's not a static one-off and we're done in that world. So.
Yeah. So this is actually a good segue. So one of the things that I wanted to discuss with you, because you're an expert in the field and you have a lot of talks on this, is actually, if we take it practical, imagine some company takes their teams, gives them Cursor, Windsurf, Plot Code, any agentic tool, and they're watching what you're saying about context, and probably they have a bulb in their head saying, we're actually not doing any of what they are talking about. So what are the smallest first steps that you would suggest these teams to do? Maybe evaluated skill or maybe context rule with tests or CI. Where should they begin? If you say like, these are the 3 steps as a company you should make sure to do before, you go and roll out all the agentic tools that you have there for coding.
Yeah. Well, I think most companies have kind of an agentic coding, but they're using it more as a solo. I do this and maybe I kind of improve my life. I think the nurture is, okay, can we land whatever you learn or your agent isn't doing somewhere in an instruction file or a rules file or a Claude MD, right? That's probably the first thing I'll look for, almost like on a maturity level. If I don't see it there, I know, like, okay, they're still doing kind of the manual almost loop, right? If you have that and the sharing happening, it could be in your repo, it could be you package it to one of the marketplaces or registries to do that. Then you start looking at, okay, are people keeping this up to date as an artifact so others can reuse this? So I would advise almost like developer experience and platform teams saying like, hey, we're building this central registry of that context. Is it being used by others? So that you go across team, maybe across project, across agents, or different tools that you use, and you start like building that up. And it's not that we couldn't do this a year and a half ago. Like we could have done this technically, but it's more like the more people get on there, the more kind of we do this, we realize there needs to be a better process. And I think it's simple steps like start writing that down. If it's not working, write as skills. Even if somebody's really skeptical to use AI, right? And they say, it doesn't do that well. It's crap. I know things better. Okay, great. Do you want to be our skills writer? And that teaches the AI to do it better. So you can even get the critics on board because they have domain knowledge. And they might also be willing to write. Maybe they write it now in their wikis, but it's like where the rubber meets the road right now is in the context of the agent. And that's kind of like turning that into a context producing almost like flow within the company by doing little steps. Like it could be from the solo, write it down to, hey, we have it in a repo. Yes, we're sharing this out across teams. I think it's something that is very doable, and it's more like, oh, I need a direction to do this, and I think about it that way instead of it. Oh yeah, these developers, they have their tools, their toys. Let them kind of stutter. No, this is engineering this out in an organization.
Yes, fantastic. I think this is really the most important part, actually, that harnessing agents is not job of one person. I think if you have a platform team, it's great. If you're a startup with 10 engineers, it's essentially the job of each of them to provide and grow the context and share the skills and tools, MCPs, whatever you built. I recently even saw some guys from some squad in Sonar who built the tools for the agent to actually generate the context out of whatever agent is doing. Something that you touched also to observability and logs and why these specific decisions to then actually navigate the agent for the next cycles in the right direction. Patrick, thank you so much for sharing all these insights, and thank you everyone for watching. Enjoy the rest of the Sonar Summit. I hope to see more, Patrick, of your wisdom on context. Yeah. And if you want to share any links or how people can find you.
If you're interested in the blog post that were mentioned on the context flywheel and the context development lifecycle, you can go to tesla.io/blog and you find the articles there. I'm easy to reach on LinkedIn or wherever. Just ping me. I have my own blog on jedi.be. So anything I post, any conference talk, you'll find there as well. So I'm easy to reach. I'm willing to learn from you. So
fantastic. Thank you much again, Patrick. And to everybody else, enjoy the summit and looking forward for the rest of the day.
Perfect.